Okay, so today I want to discuss something that the mainstream media is fundamentally misrepresenting, and I want you to understand the actual strategic mechanics at play in the Persian Gulf right now, because what we are watching unfold is not a series of isolated incidents. What we are watching is a cascading system failure in the American naval blockade strategy, and it is producing consequences that will reshape global energy markets within weeks, not months. Let me be transparent with you from the start. I am Professor Jiang, and this channel exists to decode power shifts before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay locked in, because this particular situation gets exponentially worse the deeper you examine it. Now let me establish the factual sequence first, because the narrative being sold to the American public is simply false. On June 2nd, U.S. Central Command disabled an oil tanker flagged to Botswana, the MT Lexi, by firing a Hellfire missile directly into its engine room. This was not a defensive action. This was an enforcement of a blockade against Iranian maritime commerce. The ship's crew ignored repeated warnings over a 24-hour period, and the United States destroyed its propulsion system. That is the first domino. In response, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps attacked a commercial vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. Then the United States responded by bombing Qashm Island, an Iranian territory. Then Iran responded by launching coordinated ballistic missile and drone strikes against U.S. military installations in Kuwait, Iraq, and Bahrain. Multiple rounds. The IRGC issued a statement that I want you to hear clearly. They said, "The era of hit and run is over. Any new foolishness will be met with a seismic, crushing, and decisive response that goes beyond established rules and boundaries." That language matters. That is not rhetoric. That is a strategic declaration. Let me ask you a question. How did we arrive at this moment? Why did the United States believe it could enforce a unilateral blockade against Iranian oil exports without triggering a direct military response? Why did American planners assume that destroying commercial vessels would remain contained? Why not expect Iran to escalate? This is where the strategic miscalculation becomes visible. Let me bring in a concept that strategists call the Malacca dilemma. This refers to the vulnerability of global shipping to disruption at critical choke points. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a waterway. It is the single most critical energy artery on the planet. Approximately 30% of all seaborne oil transits through that strait. 30%. When you establish a blockade there, you are not punishing Iran in isolation. You are introducing systemic risk into the entire global energy supply chain. And here is what no one in Washington seems to have calculated. Iran has the capacity to make that strait unusable for weeks or even months. Now think about what this means. World oil inventories are currently falling at a record pace. They have dropped below the 6.8 billion barrel threshold. According to Neil Chapman, the senior vice president of Exxon, we are approaching what he calls unheard of inventory levels. Chapman stated publicly that once inventories hit certain low thresholds, which he estimated would occur within 2 to 3 weeks, crude prices would spike to $150 to $160 per barrel. That was his assessment last week. We are now 1.5 weeks away from that inflection point. Let me dwell on this for a moment, because the economic consequences are not theoretical. If oil reaches $180 to $200 per barrel, the average American gasoline price moves to $6 to $7 per gallon. That is not a market fluctuation. That is an economic shock. That cascades through transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, heating costs. It touches every consumer good. And the trigger for this shock is not OPEC production decisions or geopolitical risk premiums in the abstract. The trigger is the specific decision to enforce a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz while global oil reserves are at critically low levels. Okay, now let me address something directly. The official U.S. narrative claims that all Iranian missiles and drones were intercepted, that no American personnel were harmed, and that the situation remains stable. The IRGC claims the opposite. They claim they successfully struck the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters and multiple air bases using ballistic missiles and drones. One of these narratives is false. And here is the deeper problem. We cannot verify which one because both sides have every incentive to misrepresent the damage assessment. But what we can verify is the pattern of escalation. We can verify that Iranian strikes are becoming more sophisticated, more coordinated, and more explicitly targeted at American military command infrastructure. That is the trend that matters. Let me take you back to a historical parallel that illuminates what is happening right now. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil-producing states imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other nations supporting Israel. The embargo lasted only 5 months, but the consequences were transformative. Oil prices quadrupled, gasoline lines formed across America, inflation spiked. The embargo did not destroy the American economy, but it revealed a structural vulnerability that the United States had not previously acknowledged. Dependence on Middle Eastern energy could be weaponized. That realization led to decades of strategic repositioning, naval bases, aircraft carrier deployments, military alliances with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. The entire post-1973 American Middle East strategy was built on preventing a repeat of that vulnerability. Now, in 2024, the United States is recreating the conditions for exactly that scenario. But this time, the blockade is unilateral rather than multilateral, and the Iranian response is direct military action rather than economic embargo. The risk profile is higher, the escalation pathway is more volatile, and the oil market is far tighter than it was in 1973. Okay. Let me shift now to what this means for the broader geopolitical order. The central thesis here is this. The American blockade strategy is designed to weaken Iran's economy and constrain its regional influence. But the actual effect is to strengthen Iran's leverage over global energy markets while simultaneously demonstrating the fragility of American naval dominance in contested waters. Every Hellfire missile fired at a commercial tanker is a message to the global shipping industry that the Strait of Hormuz is no longer a secure corridor. Every Iranian ballistic missile launched at a U.S. airbase is a demonstration that American military superiority in the region is not absolute. The blockade is weakening Iran economically, yes, but it is strengthening Iran strategically by proving that it can impose costs on the United States and its allies. This is the paradox. This is what no one is talking about. The United States believes it is winning because it is enforcing its will militarily. But the metric of success in this kind of conflict is not tactical. It is not whether you can shoot down more missiles or disable more ships. The metric is strategic leverage. And on that measure, Iran is gaining leverage every single day because global oil markets are tightening and Iran controls one of the few remaining levers that can disrupt those markets. Now, I want to be clear. I am not saying the United States will lose a direct military confrontation with Iran. I am not saying that American naval forces are inferior. What I am saying is that military superiority in the traditional sense does not translate into strategic victory in a situation where your adversary controls critical infrastructure. In this case, the Strait of Hormuz and the oil that flows through it. Sun Tzu wrote that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Iran is not trying to defeat the American military. Iran is trying to make the cost of continued blockade so economically painful that the United States will negotiate. And the tightening oil market is making that strategy increasingly plausible. Let me address the political dimension as well. Secretary of State Marco Rubio testified before the Senate that the war is over, that America has won decisively, and yet in the same week, the IRGC is launching coordinated strikes on American military bases. American soldiers are being killed. The blockade is being actively enforced with lethal force. The ceasefire that Rubio referenced is not holding. It is not even real in any meaningful sense. What exists instead is a state of active military confrontation that both sides are managing just below the threshold of full-scale war. But management is not stability. Management is precarious, and precarious situations have a tendency to break. Okay, let me bring this together now. The sequence of events in the Persian Gulf is not random. It is the logical consequence of American blockade strategy meeting Iranian resistance in a context of critically tight global oil markets. The U.S. fires at a tanker, Iran fires back, the U.S. escalates, Iran escalates. Each cycle raises the probability of a mistake, a miscalculation, a strike that goes further than intended. And if that happens, if the Strait of Hormuz becomes actively contested, if shipping insurance premiums spike, if tankers begin routing around Africa to avoid the strait, then oil prices do not just spike, they explode, and that explosion cascades through every economy on the planet. Now, I want you to understand something else. This is not accidental. The architects of American Middle East policy understand the oil market dynamics perfectly. They understand that a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would cause global economic shock. So why are they pursuing a blockade strategy that increases the probability of exactly that outcome? The answer is that they believe the benefits of constraining Iran outweigh the risks of oil market disruption. They are making a calculated bet that they can maintain the blockade, that Iran will eventually back down, and that global oil markets will absorb the shock. That is the bet. And it is a very high-stakes bet because if they are wrong, if Iran does not back down, if the blockade breaks, if oil reaches $200 per barrel, then the shock ripples through the American economy itself. Gas prices spike, inflation accelerates, consumer purchasing power declines, and in an election year, that becomes a political catastrophe. Let me ask you this: is that calculation rational? Is it wise? I want you to question everything I'm saying. I want you to examine the evidence independently. But from where I sit, analyzing the incentive structures and the strategic mathematics, the risk-reward profile of this blockade strategy looks increasingly unfavorable. The United States is trading a high probability of moderate economic damage. Oil price spikes, inflation, consumer pain, for a low probability of strategic success, which is the eventual capitulation of Iran. That is not a favorable bet in any rational framework. And here is the deeper issue. The blockade strategy assumes that American economic resilience is greater than Iranian economic resilience. But that assumption may be incorrect. The American economy is vulnerable to oil price shocks because American consumers depend on cheap gasoline and cheap energy. The Iranian economy has been under sanctions for decades. It has adapted. It has developed alternative supply chains. It has learned to operate in a constrained environment. So when oil prices spike, Iran suffers, yes. But America suffers too. And the political tolerance for that suffering is much lower in a democracy than in an authoritarian state. Okay, let me address the final piece of this puzzle. What happens next? If the pattern continues, if the U.S. maintains the blockade, if Iran continues to escalate, if oil inventories continue to fall, then we arrive at the inflection point that Chapman described. Within 2 to 3 weeks, possibly sooner, global oil inventories hit critical lows. At that moment, any disruption in supply, any successful Iranian strike on a tanker, any closure of the strait, any accident or miscalculation triggers a price spike, not a gradual increase. A spike. From $90 to $110 per barrel to $150, $180, possibly $200 per barrel in days, not weeks. That spike cascades through the global economy. Inflation accelerates. Central banks face impossible choices. Do they raise interest rates and trigger a recession, or do they accommodate inflation and risk currency destabilization? Either path is economically painful. And the trigger for all of this is a military escalation in the Persian Gulf that nobody seems to be seriously trying to de-escalate. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about something. I am not predicting that this outcome is certain. I am not saying that war is inevitable. What I'm saying is that the current trajectory, the blockade, the Iranian escalation, the tightening oil markets, creates a scenario in which an economic shock becomes increasingly probable. And that shock, if it materializes, will reshape global markets and American politics in ways that are difficult to overstate. Let me close with this. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming very loudly. We have seen this pattern before. We have seen blockades trigger escalation. We have seen escalation trigger economic shocks. We have seen economic shocks trigger political upheaval. The question is not whether these patterns are real. The question is whether the people making decisions in Washington understand them. And based on the testimony of Secretary Rubio and the continued enforcement of the blockade, I would suggest that they do not. I am Professor Jiang. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and pay very close attention to the oil market over the next 2 weeks. That is where the real story is being written.